Hi, I'm Nick Thomas at the Academy of Historical Fencing, and this is Royal Artillery swords in the Napoleonic era. Now, anybody familiar with this channel will know that I spend a lot of time talking about British infantry swords of this particular era, and that's largely because I absolutely love them, I collect them, I study their use, and I fight with them. Now, if you look at general history of the Napoleonic period, a lot of attention is given to cavalry combat with swords, and that's justifiable because that's where swords were being used more, but often swords used on foot don't get a lot of attention, and therefore I'm going to look at another area that doesn't get much attention, and that is swords of the Royal Artillery. And it just so happens that I have a few that are, particularly one that is exceptionally rare to talk about. So I'm going to talk about all the swords that were used by the Royal Artillery, both on foot and on horseback, across officers, NCOs and enlisted men. Now, to get started with, why would the artillery use a sword at all? Because the infantry, the British infantry at that time, the standard enlisted man did not carry a sword. They used a musket or rifle and a bayonet. There were instances of swords being used by infantrymen in specialist roles such as skirmishers, riflemen and things like that. But as a rule, swords in that time were for cavalry, for officers, NCOs, and a few others, but not that many. So why would the artillery carry swords at all, whether it's a short sword or a larger sword? Simply put, it is necessity for defence and convenience. So the Royal Artillery were issued with muskets and bayonets, but as you can imagine, that wasn't hugely practical. If they're trying to man guns, and operating artillery pieces, operating guns, means manoeuvring them, loading them, firing them. You can't really be carrying a musket at that time. So even though the enlisted men of the Royal Artillery were issued with muskets and bayonets, they were usually used for sentry duties and things like that. Whereas if they actually went onto the battlefield manning a gun, their artillery piece, they would not be able to carry a musket. Now, why do I use the term gun? Gun was used for an artillery piece at the time, so something that is on a carriage or in a fixed emplacement. So the term today, the way the term is used today, the term gun, is it's used for any kind of firearm, but technically a handgun is a gun that you can carry in your hands. An actual gun is on wheels or an emplacement, something like that, or on a tank, for example. So, if you're going to man guns, you need to have your hands free, and therefore you can't carry a musket very easily. You can sling it over your back, but it would be an inconvenience. And a musket and bayonet isn't necessarily the best weapon to fight in certain skirmish scenarios that an artilleryman might find themselves in as well. So why would an artilleryman need a sword? Well, artillery are a valuable target. Now, you might think that being in the artillery you should be way away from the enemy, although let's not forget these aren't the long-range guns of World War II, so they were a little bit closer to the enemy than you might think. But in theory, you should be far enough away from the enemy that you don't have to get into hand-to-hand combat. The reality is that's an ideal scenario that doesn't always happen, because the artillery, the guns, they are really, really valuable to the army and a valuable target to the enemy, and therefore at any opportunity the enemy gets, they're going to try and take out the artillery. And when I say take out, that usually means killing the gun crews or spiking the guns. So spiking the guns usually means hammering something like a nail or similar into the touch hole, which is how you ignite a gun or artillery piece, and therefore you disable that gun, at least for the short term, for that battle. There's a possibility of also stealing the guns, but that's a little bit more difficult because they're heavy and cumbersome. So usually if artillery gets attacked, it's to kill the gun crews or spike the guns, and therefore artillerymen need to be able to defend their own lives and specifically defend those valuable guns. So they're going to have to be able to defend them. They can't just run away at every opportunity. And therefore, they need a weapon to defend themselves, but it also needs to be a weapon of convenience that they can wear and carry on their normal duties of operating those guns. Now, the swords used by the Royal Artillery break down into three categories, and that is the Spadroon, the hanger, and the sabre. Now, you've seen that hanger a little bit earlier, that's what I was carrying just a moment ago. The Spadroon is the relatively light cut and thrust blade that is straight and medium length. This is a Spadroon. And the sabre, which is curved, although can vary immensely in length and mass or weight. So those are the three different swords that we're going to be talking about in this video today. And it also breaks down not just by those three categories of weapon, but the users. So we're going to talk about officers, We've got to talk about NCOs, that's non-commissioned officers, essentially sergeants and similar, warrant officers, and then your enlisted men, who are just essentially your common soldiers. And we need to talk about all of those things. Now, as I said, in the infantry, the most common soldiers did not carry a sword of any kind, but in the artillery, that was different. So we are going to be talking about all those different ranks. We're going to start with the foot artillery, and therefore we're going to start with officers. Now, officers follows the standard infantry regulations of the time, and that meant carrying the 1796 pattern or regulation infantry officer's sword. And that is a 32-inch by 1-inch minimum at the shoulder here, straight cut and thrust sword. Now, it had mixed success. There were some actually good examples and there were some terrible ones. Certainly, Captain Mercer of the Horse Artillery mentioned his hatred of this particular weapon, and that's probably fair because there were some terrible, terrible examples of these swords being made, particularly as a lot of them were made by or sold by tailors. Essentially, they were called tailors' swords. So you just go to an outfitter that's, you buy a uniform from, and you buy a sword from them, and it's of mixed quality. There were some terrible examples. So it's hit and miss, but anyway, that's the Spadroon, the infantry officer's Spadroon. And in the foot artillery, the sergeants, NCOs, also carried the same regulation sword. It's just a little bit plainer. If you look at it functionally, it's exactly the same sword. It's the same length, same blade type, same hilt type, and same handling characteristics. It is exactly the same sword functionally. It's just not quite as pretty as the officer's version. Gets extra detailing and also gold gilt onto the brass as opposed to the plain brass of the NCO or sergeant's sword, as well as a copper grip as opposed to silver. But functionally exactly the same sword. So that covers your officers and your sergeants of the artillery. It's also worth mentioning at the time, in the Napoleonic period, lots of sabres were also used against regulation. There was a case in the infantry, it probably happened in the artillery as well, of officers getting away with either a more fashionable sword that they thought would be nicer with their uniform, or potentially a better fighting sword. It could be a bit of both. So it's a possibility that some of those, not the NCOs, because they were actually issued their swords, but the officers had to buy their own swords. There's a possibility that some artillery officers did buy some kind of sabre instead. Now, onto the enlisted men. This is the enlisted man's foot artillery sword for the Napoleonic period. Now, this is a subject which is really not well known about. It's barely covered in any books, and very few people actually even are familiar with this sword pattern. In fact, it doesn't even really follow a pattern, although it is standardized for its time. And, okay, this is a hanger. Now, what is a hanger? A hanger is just a short sword, and it's the land equivalent of cutlass, and sometimes the terms hanger and cutlass are used interchangeably. So, for example, the police sword in the 19th century was often called a cutlass, despite the fact that they're obviously using it on land. So this is a hanger because it's an army sword, but technically it could be a cutlass or hanger. So it's just a short sword. And by short, we usually mean a blade length under about 28 or 29 inch. Under that is usually considered a short sword. It's not exactly a strict line, but roughly under that will be a short sword. And what makes this quite an incredible sword is just how heavy it is, and you can't really get a sense of that from just looking at it. Now, obviously it's broad. It has no profile taper at all from here at the shoulder to the tip, which is a little bit unusual, to say the least, for this time period. And not only that, it has very little distal taper. So distal taper is the thickness or the width of the blade here and how much that tapers down to the tip. And most swords do taper quite a lot in terms of thickness from here to here. This one doesn't. It has barely any distal taper from the shoulder here until it gets to this section here, which just tapers in to the point, and that is not a sharpened back edge. This sword has been service sharpened, that back edge section has not. It's just tapered in there to make it better at thrust work. It's not actually sharpened. Now, that makes this sword particularly heavy for its size. It is very small, so to show you in terms of scale, that's its size compared to a very famous 1796 pattern light cavalry sword. or sabre. So this is one of the most famous swords of its day and known for being a heavy, brutal cutting sword. This artillery short sword is heavier than that. This is 956 grams, which is approximately 2.1 pounds, and the average range for the light cavalry sabre is about 900 grams to 1 kilo. So this is right up there in that cavalry weight range, which is quite incredible. And if you just swing it, and especially if you close your eyes and swing it around, it feels like a light cavalry sabre. And by that I mean, it feels like it has a lot of mass and energy at the tip, just like the 1796 does. Why does it feel like that? Because that's exactly what it is. Because of this wide profile and lack of distal taper, it has ended up being a sword with a lot of mass in the tip, despite its small size. And it does have the balance very similar to a light cavalry sabre, and as I said, that mass distribution is certainly similar as well. So, why? Because that's unusual. This makes it one of the heaviest swords in use by the British Army of that period, despite the fact that it's also one of the smallest. Notice they call it a short sword and not a small sword. It is small, but a small sword is this, the civilian thrust only, has no cutting edges usually. Thrust only sword, that's a small sword. So we won't call it a small sword, it's called a short sword. So this is a short sword or hanger. Why would it be so heavy? Well, we don't definitely know for certain because there's not much written about these swords in the period they were used, very little at all. So we're left to speculate. So really we have to look at evidence of other tools and swords being used and then speculate also on its use. And I would say there are realistically two core reasons that the sword might be, or the blade specifically, because the hilt is nothing unusual. The hilt follows the light cavalry pattern of 1788. That's a standard form that you see on Spadroons as well. It's not unusual at all. What is unusual about this is the blade, and it looks a little bit like the cutlass blade of the 1804 cutlass blade. In fact, it's a little bit shorter and has a lot less distal taper and mass in it, so it's a little bit different to that as well. It's basically a heavier, more brutal chopper than the cutlass blade is. So why? Yeah, two reasons I would say, or likely reasons, is me speculating. One, tools, machetes essentially, were sometimes or often issued in the 20th century, for example, to machine gun teams, and they were used to clear the path for setting up of machine guns in much the same way an artilleryman may need to clear a path to deploy a gun. So I speculate, possibly, that this is as much a fighting weapon as it is a tool. So you can hack through some foliage and create a good gun position for your artillery piece. The other possibility is that who are you likely to fight as a foot artilleryman? Remember I said they're going to get targeted wherever the enemy can target them. So if you get rushed as an artilleryman and you have to defend either your life or your gun or both, you're likely going to be facing either an infantryman with a musket or rifle with a bayonet, or a cavalryman with some kind of sabre, maybe like the cuirassier swords that you see, sort of palash type weapons, possibly even a lance, because they did have some use in that period as well. So you're going to be fighting something that is much bigger and heavier and just meatier than any kind of sword that you could carry on foot. And therefore, it's possible that it was designed for that purpose. So it's a short sword. It had to be a short sword because it had to be convenient to carry for a foot artilleryman. But perhaps it was made exceptionally robust so that it could deal with those weapons. It's been made the weight of a cavalry weapon, perhaps so that it could actually make parries and binds and actually stand a chance of not being beaten through by those much heavier weapons, whether it's a musket or a cavalry sword. There's a possibility that it's both of those things. It could be a machete-style tool and a heavy weapon of defense. It could be something else entirely, but I speculate that it's probably those two things combined, is that it's a robust tool as well as something fairly robust for defense when the time arises, because if the artillery get rushed, it's going to be a chaotic defense against probably overwhelming numbers with substantially better and beefier weapons than you've got. Now, in terms of hangers of this period, the term sometimes you'll come across is Spanish hanger, and it's often referred, this particular example is often referred to as the Spanish hanger. We don't know for certain if that's accurate. We know the term appears around about that time, of the Napoleonic period, or maybe just after, and it's speculated that it's called that because it was adopted during the Peninsular Campaign in Spain and Portugal. That's possibly true. It's also possible that the Spanish hanger does refer to a slightly different hanger that was adopted in Spain as well. There are a few notes and illustrations occasionally of a more curved, similarly sized but a more curved blade, and the P-shaped guard of the 1796 light cavalry sword being adopted, possibly even with a sawback on the back of the blade like later pioneer swords. But there's just so little evidence and documentation to really know, were they being used, was that the Spanish hanger, was this the Spanish hanger? We don't know. The only thing we can say for certain is that this particular Royal Artillery hanger was the one that was being used, and it is documented in various pieces of contemporary artwork. So this is the one that we know was definitely getting common usage with the Royal Artillery at that time. So the obvious question with this particular hanger is actually, how good is it? How successful is it at its job? Well, it's really hard to say for certain because it's difficult to find individual sword accounts, even from just combat on foot in that time. There aren't that many around, so looking specifically for the artillery is going to be difficult, and then knowing exactly which sword they're carrying, hard to always say. But there's one where we definitely know, and that is in the 1809, Adventures of Benjamin Miller that I discovered recently. And he describes an event during the Peninsular Campaign where him and his fellow gunners were in a house and forced to defend themselves against Spanish troops. Now, those Spanish troops were allies at the time, but there was a dispute over food and supplies, and the Spanish troops attacked these gunners, who were all equipped with the short sword, and they used these short swords to dispatch those Spanish soldiers with ease. A few short cuts and thrusts that were powerfully delivered, and they were killed rapidly. So there's only so much we can take away from that single account, but what we can say for definite is they were used successfully and did their job, and I don't think really that's any surprise. If you had to defend yourself in a house and you had this sword, nice and compact for tight spaces, it's going to thrust like some gladius, and it's going to frankly cut like a lot of gladius as well, which were known to be good cutting swords despite the fact that they're known more for thrusting today. It's a powerful cut and thrust sword. Its only disadvantage is that it's short. So in that scenario, close-up fighting, why wouldn't it be quite decent? It's not especially an agile weapon, it is a little bit cumbersome, but it's small enough that you can move it around and actually deliver some really quite brutal cuts and thrusts with it. So why wouldn't it be effective? Obviously, reach is always a factor, and it wouldn't be particularly fun trying to fight a cavalryman with a sabre, or to be honest, even infantry with bayonets. A short sword is going to suffer in that regard. But it's a meaty short sword, it's probably going to be robust enough for the job, and it's a hell of a lot better than not having anything at all. So let's move on to the horse artillery, which isn't an especially useful term at the time because all artillery, all guns were pulled by horses. But in 1793, horse artillery were adopted in the British Army, following trends within Europe that were already quite common. And the concept of horse artillery is they are mobile. So your foot artillery, the horses are used to pull the guns up to a battlefield, set up in a gun battery, a line of guns if you like, and usually stay in position and act from that position on the battlefield without much movement. Now the idea of the horse artillery is they use speed to deploy around the battlefield and adapt to the scenario, so they can maneuver quickly and adapt to the scenario. And as a rule, they usually sacrifice the power of their guns, as they usually have slightly lower power guns, obviously because they're having to, use their horses to drag them around faster and more often. And they were an incredibly successful application of artillery at that time, unsurprisingly, because tactically, horse artillery, okay, you sacrifice maybe a little bit of power with your guns because they're lower caliber, but you can get them to where they need to be easily and quickly. And even within hours they can deploy, or even minutes at times, to different parts of the battlefield, adapt to different scenarios, and be where they need to be. So it was a popular and successful concept at the time. And the horse artillery, when they were formed, they immediately followed light cavalry regulations in many ways, or at least based on them. and that meant that they adopted light cavalry sabres. Initially the 1788 regulation, but being as they only formed in 1793, they only had that for 3 years, and very quickly adopted the famous 1796 light cavalry trooper's sabre. Now, officers in the horse artillery would have carried the same sword, just the officer's version, which functionally is exactly the same. It usually will have blue and gilt on the blade, and the ears here are a slightly different shape, but functionally it's exactly the same sword. So it's a 33-inch bladed, well curved, heavy, and not excessively heavy, it's more agile than you would think, but it certainly can deliver a lot of power on the cut, and it can still thrust. People are often under the assumption that this can't thrust. It absolutely can thrust. And it was a really well-regarded fighting sword. It obviously doesn't have a huge amount of protection, but it was an incredibly successful sword for its time. There is also a possibility that other similar stirrup-hilted sabres were used by the cavalry. So, for example, the later mountain artillery sword that we know from the late 19th century, we know that there were examples of those going back to the Napoleonic era. We just don't know who was using them. Maybe it was the horse artillery, maybe it was batteries back at home, back in the UK. We don't really know. All we know is that the horse artillery was supposed to use a light cavalry sabre. They probably mostly used actually a light cavalry sabre like this, this is a regulation Enlisted man light cavalry sabre. They probably used these. They may have used some other not quite pattern versions of the same sword. So why cavalry swords for the horse artillery when we know that the artillery on foot were carrying spadroons and hangers? Well, ultimately because the horse artillery, although they're using horses to pull their guns the same as the foot artillery, the horse artillery are actually mounted in saddles, which not all the foot artillery were. A lot of them were on carts, basically drivers with carts and carriages. The horse artillery were mostly actually on horseback with saddles, so they're actually more a cavalry role already, and also the fact that they're moving around a battlefield much closer to the enemy, and are therefore likely to be involved in combat on horseback at times, more than their guns being rushed and being on foot. So therefore the horse artillery are quite likely, in the occasion to need to defend themselves, may well be on horseback in the saddle, and therefore it makes sense to equip themselves with the weapon of the light cavalry, which are designed to work in that fast action skirmishing kind of role. So it's a sword that really fits them quite well, and therefore it's no surprise that they adopted a lot of practices of equipment from the light cavalry. Now, what else might be used in the horse artillery? Well, enlisted men and officers, I've already said, used the light cavalry trooper's sabre, but they did also have, the officers at least, had a lighter sword for other duties, particularly dress functions, and not just for dress, but for anything that's not going to be a battlefield scenario. And they did carry a lighter sabre, which was based on their trooper's sabre, but lighter. And Mercer makes it clear, Captain Mercer of the Royal Horse Artillery at that time, makes it clear that they didn't follow an exact pattern, they just did something similar but lighter, so it could take a few different forms. And that is entirely possible, an example of the sort of form that they would have followed. So it looks a bit like a 1796 light cavalry sabre, and certainly the hilt is based on it. It's exactly the same kind of hilt, just made with a brass guard. But the blade here is a flat, unfulled, Shamshir-inspired blade that became really popular after the campaign in Egypt. And this fashion trend really did catch on, only with a minority of officers, but it was a fair minority. And even, Wellington was carrying a blade similar to this, for example, and even with a hilt more inspired by the Shamshirs as well. So it's possible that, it is certain that they carried lighter versions of their sabres. It could have been like this, the Shamshir-inspired types, or it could quite literally just be a downsized, lighter version of the light cavalry sabre, as we know a lot of infantry officers, particularly flank officers, were carrying in that time. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. We've covered all of the swords used by the artillery, both on foot and on horseback. It's important to remember that for artillerymen, their primary means of defence, so not offence because they're using their guns for that, their primary means of defence in most scenarios was some kind of sword. And you wouldn't always necessarily want to have to use it, but sometimes they were forced to, and they did actually have some quite substantial and quite decent fighting swords for their time and place. So I really hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed already, please do so. I do intend to make more videos like this talking about the different types of sword in use, particularly as you know my love of British infantry swords of this era. So thanks for watching.